Hi friends, welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and today it's my end of February reading roundup. Hi, so here we are. It's the end of February and time for my reading roundup for the month. Now, for those new to the channel, I'm currently doing a Read What You Own challenge. Basically what happened was I got to the end of last year and realised I had a TBR of 243 books, which was way too many, and I was tripping over piles of them on the floor here, and I just had to do something about it. So, inspired by another YouTuber I follow called Criminoli, I decided to do a Read What You Own challenge. Read 100 books without buying any new ones. Effectively a book buying ban until I got it done. And so, I embarked on that in January, and in January I read 11 books, which was great. I didn't buy any. So that was a really good start to the challenge. But if you've seen my mid-month reading roundup for February, you'll know the first half of the month didn't go so well. I only read 3 books, which actually is about my usual pace, I have to say. Looking back over previous months and years, my reading record tends to show that I read roughly 5 or 6 books a month, so that's not too much of a surprise. But it's not really going to cut it for this Read What You Own challenge, because I'll be doing it for probably about 18 months if that's the case. So I have to step it up a bit, and I knew I had to in the second half of this month. So how did I get on? Well, that's the big question, isn't it? So let's answer that. Well, let's first talk about the 3 books I read in the first half of February. I'm only going to be very brief here because obviously I've already done a video on them, so you can look at that and I'll link it somewhere or other if you want more information about these particular books. So those 3 were these: I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, The Dirty Life and Times of Warren Zevon, the American singer-songwriter. I would heartily recommend this. It's very funny, also strangely sad at times, and just an all-around really good, entertaining read. Very highly recommended, that one. I also read the 8th in the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, The Weird Tales of William Hope Hodgson, an author I'm already a huge fan of. I knew all these tales pretty much. It's still very good, obviously, and I would recommend it fairly highly as a solid introduction to the author if you're not familiar with him. And the third one that I read in the first half of the month was the second Hammer Horror Film Omnibus, which actually contains 4 short novels based on Hammer movies. And that's okay. I enjoyed it, but I wouldn't particularly recommend it. And moving to the second half of the month and the new books that I read, or the books I haven't featured yet on the channel, I'm going to gloss over the first of those a bit. I'm going to deal with it very quickly because I've already posted a video about it. And that's the 9th book in the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, Doorway to Dilemma. And as I say, I've already done a video where I've reviewed numbers 7, number 8, the William Hope Hodgson one, and this one as number 9. So again, I'll see if I can link that somewhere so you can go and watch that if you want more information about this. But yeah, that was the 4th one that I read in February. So now we'll move on to the rest of the month. And the 5th book I read in the month of February was this one, Charcoal Joe by Walter Mosley, the 14th book in his Easy Rawlins series, which began in 1990 with Devil in a Blue Dress, which you may have seen filmed with Denzel Washington. Now, Easy Rawlins is a black man who comes back from serving in World War II and starts working as a kind of private eye in the Watts area of LA in the United States. And the series follows him through the years, and he struggles to basically survive and still earn a living as he acquires his own somewhat unusual family, and American society changes around him. Now, in Charcoal Joe, we've reached 1968, and this is the era, of course, of the hippie dream and civil rights. And Easy has become successful enough over the years to now open his own private detective agency with 2 colleagues. But of course, the odds are still stacked against him in a white man's world. So in this entry, a notorious gangster, the Charcoal Joe of the title, asks Easy to help get a black physics major off the hook after the young man is found standing over 2 murdered men in an upmarket house in an isolated part of the city. And this leads Easy into a tangled web of murder and mayhem which involves more than $1 million of stolen mob money and a cache of hidden diamonds. And there is also a large cast of strange, unusual and suspicious characters who all might be responsible. Now, if you've seen some of the other videos on this channel, you'll already know that I'm a huge fan of this series, and Easy in particular as a character, and the way he has to navigate his way through the dangerous waters of a changing American landscape. In fact, you could actually argue that this is an alternate history of America from the ground up, and I just love this world building that Mosley gives us here, and also this really large incidental cast of supporting characters who turn up semi-regularly from one book to the next. It's an absorbing series, although in the past I have found some of it a little uneven, particularly early on, and that mostly revolves around the plotting. But after taking a break from the series in 2007's Blonde Faith, Mosley came back really strong in 2013 with Little Green, and the follow-up to that, Rose Gold, which I reviewed on the channel, and this one, while those 3 books all, to my mind, make a case for being the strongest in the series so far. In all respects, plotting, writing, characterizations, it just all keeps getting better and better. So personally, this is a really high recommendation from me. If you love crime, you should really get into Easy Rawlins. So, after that, my next book was A Slight Change of Pace. And this is Conversations with Wilder by Cameron Crowe, which is a series of interviews that Crowe, a director himself, conducted with the legendary Hollywood filmmaker Billy Wilder in the late 1990s. Now, if you're not familiar with Wilder, he's a legend in filmmaking circles. He was active in Hollywood from the late 1930s to the early 1980s, and during that time as a co-writer-director, he delivered such classics as Double Indemnity, Ace in the Hole, The Lost Weekend, Sunset Boulevard, The Apartment, Some Like It Hot. The list just goes on and on. He was nominated 21 times for Oscars and won 6 of them. And Cameron Crowe, the interviewer here and ex-journalist, was also a film director, and I hate to use the past phrase because he is a film director, sorry about that. At this point he'd only made 3 movies, but the third of which was Jerry Maguire, which was obviously a mega hit for Tom Cruise, and was also nominated for several Oscars. One of the other things Crowe was at the time, and probably still is again, is a super fan of Wilder and his films. And this is an absorbing collection of interview transcripts from where they cover all sorts of subjects, mostly regarding cinema, but also some wider issues too. But of course there are plenty of anecdotes about Hollywood, about their stars, the directors, and making movies. And one of the most interesting sections is what he has to say about Marilyn Monroe, because he worked with her twice, and he talks about the legendary occasions where it took around 80 takes for her to deliver up one line, which was, I think, "Where's the bourbon?" And also another occasion on the same film, Some Like It Hot, where she couldn't get a handle on the line, "It's me, sugar." Which apparently she had to do about 40 odd times. But at the same time as all this, there was one occasion during filming where she had a 3-page dialogue scene, and apparently she nailed it the first time, so much so that it was just that was the only take they bothered with. Wilder didn't even bother scheduling another take. She was absolutely perfect. We don't really get to see behind the professional mask too much here. Wilder has a reputation through his movies for being a weary cynic with an acerbic wit. And yes, there's plenty of evidence of that, but you do get a little bit of a glimpse of the man too, and perhaps most strangely a surprising streak of romanticism, which he'd probably deny if you actually asked him about it. Wilder's mantra was simply to entertain, and entertain through these interviews he most certainly does. And if you were to ask me that old question about which 6 people would I invite to dinner, living or dead? Well, Mr. Wilder might be one of the ones that I consider, although whether he'd accept my invitation is, of course, another matter entirely. So this is another recommendation from me. Obviously, fans of his work would love this, but perhaps if you're interested in cinema in general, you should check it out too. And I think we should be very grateful to Mr. Crowe for taking the time and trouble to interview Wilder, who was then in his 90s, and get this important voice actually down on paper, so we've got it for all time. Next up is this one, The Motion Demon by Stefan Grabiński. This is 9 Tales of the Supernatural linked to the railways. And this was actually a viewer recommendation. Thank you, Oscar. Because he felt that because I enjoyed The Platform Edge, which was one of the Tales of the Weird series, that I might enjoy this. And he was very right. Now, unlike The Platform Edge, which is part of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, this is a very unconventional series of stories. Okay, there are a couple here that you could say fall into that kind of mainstream spooky tales, The Wandering Train, for example, or Signals, but the more intriguing material is somewhat different because Grabiński, who lived in the early part of the 20th century, seemed to have this idea that the motion of the train, the very speed of it, would actually create some kind of elemental force that would have an influence on some of the people who were travelling. This is an influence that could be quite mild, as we see in a story called The Perpetual Passenger, who doesn't really ever engage with the idea of high-speed travel, or he doesn't actually engage with it. He engages with the idea. He's prepared to go on the trains and surrender himself to it, but he never quite does. So that's quite a mild influence. But on the other hand, sometimes this motion demon, whatever it is, manifests itself far more markedly and causes some very strange, disquieting and often dangerous behaviour. And one of the best examples of that in this collection is In the Compartment, where we get a mild-mannered clerk who's pretty timid sort of guy before he gets on the train, but once he's on the train, he sort of turns into this lusty Lothario character who ends up having sex with a passenger's wife while the poor bloke is sleeping on the other side of the compartment. But when he gets off the train afterwards, he kind of reverts back to his previous personality. It's an absolutely fascinating idea, and just one of the examples of how this motion demon affects people. My favourite story here is engine driver Grot, who becomes absolutely obsessed with travelling as fast as he can in a straight line, presumably again somehow possessed by this force, this demon. And of course things don't come to a very pleasant end for anyone in that instance. And there's also the case of the Sloven, which is about a railway guard who keeps seeing a strange naked man on various trains over his entire career. And this naked apparition always prefaces a disaster, a railway disaster where many people are killed. And that's again a fascinating story because it's the only time, apart from the very weird title story, it's the only time where we actually see this elemental force in any kind of physical form, although this is only through the eyes of one man, and we can't be sure that he's really seeing it at all, or he's seeing what he thinks he's seeing. A lot of this is very ambiguous, and that's, for me anyway, was one of its real strengths. Now, Grabiński was born in a region of Poland, which is now modern-day Ukraine, and he received some initial praise for his work in the literature field, but that faded pretty quickly, and he ended up dying in poverty at the age of 49, I think it was, in about 1936. But over the years, there have been a slow trickle of appreciation for some of his work. Most of it is short stories, I think about 20 or so maybe, and I think about 4 novels, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of information about him out there, and not all that many English translations, although there are some, and once my book buying ban is over, I'll be picking them up most definitely, because I really enjoyed this. Grabiński is a very, very vivid storyteller, paints some very unusual and interesting pictures, and I was gripped. I was fascinated by this, and I would thoroughly recommend it if you're into weird fiction. Yep, it's another recommendation. This video is full of them, to be honest. February was a great reading month, at least the second half of it especially. My only complaint actually about this book is the fact that it's very slim. It's a very short volume and only about 100 pages, which I felt was a shame because I was just dying to read more and more of his work. And I certainly be doing that in the future. And the next one is also quite unusual. Now, The Three Ravens is a podcast. It's run by Eleanor Conlon and Martin Vaux, and it deals with English and British folklore. And I've been a huge fan of it for some time. In fact, it's the only podcast that I listen to. Basically, you have 2 hosts here who have got an amazing enthusiasm for their subject, which they communicate to the audience, and it's fun, it's insightful, it's thought-provoking, and I really, really enjoy it. And part of the podcast is that the hosts retell some of the stories, the myths and legends of Britain. And sometimes these are fairly straight retellings, but other times they just use the legends as a basis for coming up with something a little new, a reimagination if you like, sometimes even setting the action in modern times. And perhaps inevitably they decided to put some of these stories into a book, and this very handsome volume is called The Three Ravens Folk Tales, and I read this one this month, despite having actually got it at Christmas time, but I kind of wanted to save it because I was really looking forward to it so much. And of course I was familiar with some of the content because I had already heard the content actually as part of their podcast, but I wasn't familiar with all of it. But perhaps that's simply because the podcast has been running quite a while now and there are a lot of episodes, and I certainly wouldn't claim to have listened to them all. Now, the format of the show is that they take one English historic county per week and they focus on its history, its myths and its legends, and one of them will recite a tale that they've written based on one of those stories. Sometimes they're chilling, sometimes they're hilariously funny, sometimes they're tragic and strangely moving. And it's a testament to the both of them as writers that they land all these different things so perfectly every time. Now, my favourites here were Conlon's A Cuckoo in Winter from Wiltshire and The Lantern Men from Huntingdonshire, and Vaux' Herne the Hunter from Berkshire, and his amusing spin on the Dick Whittington story Legend of a Cat, which originally comes from Shropshire. Now, the writing here is top quality by both authors, and it really captured the feel for me of sitting in a nook by a blazing pub fireplace while an old man puffs on his curved clay pipe and tells you a story of ye old days. It feels very authentic indeed, but also manages to filter these stories through a modern contemporary lens, and that's a pretty tricky act to pull off if you ask me. And I love this, and I can only hope that both or either of these writers favours us with some original fiction at some point. I would certainly be up for that, and I'd certainly be looking to buy it. There's one episode of the podcast, one story, that actually always sticks in my mind. It's not actually here in this volume, but it was a Martin Vaux story about a man who's called in to restore a flooded house which has been abandoned. And it was genuinely one of the creepiest things I think I've ever heard, and I'd certainly love to be able to read that in print. Now, I am interested in English folklore and storytelling, so I guess I am the target audience for this book. But having said that, I think anyone who's into weird fantasy fiction will get something out of it, and it might actually spark an interest in folklore if you haven't already got one. This is a really high recommendation for me, amongst several this month, obviously. Yeah, go out and buy this book. It's really worth your time. So that makes, by my count, we're up to 8 books for February, which, actually considering the poor start, is really very good. But by this point, I'm afraid I had less than a day left of the month. And it didn't help, obviously, that February is a very short month. But the last 2 on my TBR for the month, which I announced in my previous video, well, I wasn't going to be able to finish those because they're far too long. But what I did instead was I swapped in a very slim volume just so I could fit it in on the last day of February and get the total to 9. And that particular slim volume was this, Dominique by R. Chetwynd-Hayes, which is a movie novelisation tie-in to the film of the same name, also known as Dominique is Dead, which came out in 1979. This is the story of a well-to-do middle-aged couple named David and Dominique Ballard who live in an old English country house with a small retinue of servants. He's a businessman, she's a socialite. But just lately there's a problem. She's been exhibiting strange lapses in memory and odd behaviour, and this culminates in one night her going down to the back of the house where there's a conservatory and hanging herself. After the funeral, David then begins to experience some odd phenomena. Her piano seems to be playing itself in the middle of the night, and then he sees her ghostly figure walking through the corridors. Now this is a mystery thriller with supernatural overtones. It was directed by Michael Anderson from a script by Edward and Valerie Abraham, which was based on a short story called What Beckoning Ghost by Harold Lawler. And it's a tale of manipulation, murder and deceit. And it's pretty much an object lesson in how you can trip yourselves up if you're trying to make a film which actually involves a solution which is a little difficult to swallow. You need to get all the small details right to establish a grounded reality in order for the audience to suspend disbelief sufficiently to accept that pretty wild ending. And unfortunately, the film fumbles the ball somewhat in this respect. The film's major virtue, though, is you've got an excellent cast to help put this across. You've got Oscar winner Cliff Robertson and Oscar nominee Gene Simmons as David and Dominique. You've got Oscar nominee Ron Moody, Oscar nominee Flora Robson, as well as Jenny Agutter, Simon Ward and Judy Geeson. That is quite an impressive cast. And mostly it is a very well made film. But unfortunately the slow burn doesn't really hide the fact that there's only enough plot here really for a TV episode. Something like an anthology show, Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense, something of that nature. And the slow burn also has the unfortunate effect of allowing the audience quite a lot of time to think about things. However, I'm glad to report that the book is a considerable improvement on the film. Now, I know we normally say that, but normally it's the book that came first and not the film, but it's the other way round here. Now, obviously, Chetwynd-Hayes may have taken this assignment for an easy paycheck. That's possible, but he certainly treats the material with respect and elevates it considerably. And he does that by giving us some extra details. And those extra details aren't really about the supernatural elements, they're more about the day-to-day stuff. It just makes it more believable because the story's more grounded, and it makes it much easier for the reader to suspend their disbelief than it probably was for the viewer of the movie. In other words, Chetwynd-Hayes fixes some of the film's problems story-wise. It's also well written in Chetwynd-Hayes' typical efficient and effective style, and he also manages to slip in quite a funny in-joke at one point. There's a dinner party and one of the guests is talking about ghosts, and she says, quote, "There's a gorgeous story in that book that Collins brings out every year," end quote. Well, Chetwynd-Hayes was actually responsible for editing quite a number of anthologies in his career, and some of those were published by Collins Fontana. Now, there is one caveat I have to bring up about this review. Obviously, I haven't seen the original shooting script for the film, so it's possible that some of the additions I'm crediting to Chetwynd-Hayes were there originally in the screenplay, but for whatever reason those scenes weren't filmed, or perhaps they were edited out of the final release for time purposes. There's really no way of knowing. All I can do is judge the film based on how it appears now and the book as written. Now, this is not a major entry in Chetwynd-Hayes' bibliography, I imagine. It's a pretty minor project, but on the other hand, it is quite a good example of how an excellent craftsman can elevate some pretty unremarkable source material. So in the end, after a very slow start in the first half of the month, I managed to read 9 books, so I'm really chuffed with that. And obviously, as I didn't buy any books either, that means... oh, well, maybe I bought one. This is Death Deep Down by Dan J. Marlowe. Now, I've been collecting Marlowe's work for a couple of years, and Death Deep Down is the only title that isn't readily available. I've never seen it listed anywhere before, so when this copy came up on eBay, I couldn't resist. And it is allowed under the rules of my Read What You Own challenge. These circumstances I did allow for. The only unfortunate result of it is that I have to add 5 books to my Read What You Own total. So instead of reading 100 books, I now have to read 105. But, you know, it is only one extra book for my general TBR, isn't it? So it's not that bad. And I think I can be forgiven the odd lapse here and there. So now let's move on to the totalizer. Let's move on to the figures so you can see where the challenge is at after the end of this month. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for sticking with me till the end of the video. It's much appreciated. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Have I inspired you to pick one of them up? Because that's what this channel's really all about. That's what it's for. Please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And I'd like to thank some new subscribers who've come on board over the last month or so. We've now been joined by Thegsme, D Out of Dodge, Talia Nerds Out, Serps, Max, KV Ajita Bahawaj and Bucephalus 67. And I'd particularly like to apologise to KV there for no doubt mangling your name terribly. I'm just an ignorant English dude. I apologise. And don't forget, keep seeking out those second-hand bookshops in the back streets of your town. Keep rooting through those charity bins, going to those market stalls and car boot sales, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you.